Kemet versus Bible debate review. Yep, what's going on, party people? The place to be. I go by the name of the BK Apologist, transmitting all the way live. New York is the city. Brooklyn is the borough. What's good? What's popping? Hope everybody's doing well. Happy Friday. Hopefully you got this day off. And be careful with those fireworks. Please keep all 10 fingers, all your appendages intact. You know, every year we see these crazy videos of people just losing their hands and fingers and thumbs. And what I find interesting is people who lose their hands this year saw videos of people losing their fingers the year before. And they still, you know, so it's kind of crazy. But guys, say what's up to the party people in the chat. We got Bodega Lady D-New. We got Romy Rome in the house. And of course, as always, if you have not yet already, please like, share, and subscribe. Tell a friend that's him again. If you like how it goes down with BK, you can show your appreciation via PayPal, which is the link is pinned up on top of the chat. Or if you'd like to be a monthly supporter of BK, you could become a Patreon where you get an assortment of goodies to enhance your personal Bible study. So today, we're going to have a review of I don't know if you can call it a debate officially, but it was definitely a very interesting conversation that a good friend of mine has had when he went across the pond. And of course, I'm talking about Vocab Malone. Vocab, are you there, sir? So he's kind of here, but not really. So that's okay. You should be joining us shortly. So yes, he is driving. Wait, I see another. Okay, so I should get rid of the other one then.
Yes.
All right. Mr. Vocab Malone, how are you, sir?
Doing all right. Doing all right. Glad to be here. Sorry, I'm still getting some stuff set up. I'm catching up to what it means to be back in the USA. All my British friends I made over there are sending me these memes that tell me Happy Treason Day. And I told them, have fun at work.
That's hilarious. So, exactly. So what Vocab was talking about is his adventure when he went to Speaker's Corner. Now, for those who are not initiated in that particular location, can you tell the people what is Speaker's Corner?
Yeah, so they don't have the same type of free speech laws over there in the UK, but what they do have is a tradition of a place inside of Hyde Park, which is central London, and there everybody goes, and what do? They have free speech. And they have conversations about everything, and everything's kind of allowed to be on the table, basically. And these days, it's a lot of Christians and a lot of Muslims getting down and debating. A lot of people know Bob, for example, David. There's a number of individuals. And so that's one of the things I did. And in fact, the people that I talked to on Titans TV, some of them used to go down to Speaker's Corner. Yeah.
Right. And speaking of Titans, you had a chance to get together with Kalam L. Right?
Yeah. And I remember when I first heard of him was through Adam Coleman. And Adam says, hey, I'm going to be on Titans TV, talking to the Titans. I said, that's cool. What is it? He's like, oh, he's this guy, and he's pretty fair-minded. He does this and he does that. And that sounds pretty good. And then I remember he did a couple of reviews of some of our stuff, and he was pretty open and objective, relatively speaking. So I appreciated his approach. I was on a show once when I was going over there. I said, hey, I'm going to be in town. Want to link up? we managed to get it in on the very last night I was there. And
Mm,
that's why my voice was shot because it had been 2 weeks worth of interviews and lectures and debates and everything. But
right.
we worked it out.
No, it was good. It was good. So, so you definitely had a discussion about Kemet and the Bible, and I thought it'd be kind of cool to look at a couple of clips and get your take on it. I throw in my 2 cents, and I think you did a really good job. My only critique, if it even a critique, is your voice is horrible.
Oh, yeah.
Your
I
voice,
know.
sound like you was gargling with razor blades. So
People were like, drink water, take a throat lozenge. I was like, yo, man, you don't think I thought of that? And I did all that. They're like, talk from the diaphragm. I was like, you don't think I thought of that for 2 weeks? But we still got our limitations. So,
right,
anyways,
right, right.
and I got worse as the show went on. I started off decent, and by the end, I was sounding like, where am I? The
Well, the,
invisible
the the
man.
problem was it cold water you was drinking?
No, no, I did tea. I did the
Oh, you did
warm.
tea? Okay,
You
okay.
can't. I mean, it doesn't fix everything. I mean, like I said, I was out there for a long time, and I did a
Right.
lot of stuff. I can't believe how much content I shot. I can't believe how many people I met. I can't believe how many people I debated. I feel like the footage is going to be coming out until 2026. It's so much.
Nice, nice.
So I lost my voice. What I'm saying, but God's
Right.
good. He sustains.
That's right. That's right. So we're gonna look at a couple of clips, and we're gonna actually have vocab respond to it. That way, we can actually hear what he's saying this time, as opposed to. And so yeah, so we're gonna play this first clip. Um, it's very interesting. What's the individual that you spoke to? What's his name?
You talking about Gabs?
Yeah, the guy of the dreads, right?
Gabs,
Just
yeah.
Gab.
I guess he
All right.
also goes by Medicine Man.
Medicine
And
man.
apparently he's somewhat known down there. He used to be a regular at Speaker's Corner, is
Right.
what I'm told. I
Right.
think these days he's more in the studio. But yeah, he's an old friend of Kalam.
I, I think I gathered from you that you're obviously a Christian, and some of the points that you was talking about with Kalam. There's a particular point because obviously me, I used to be obviously a Christian growing up, a Christian household. Mom, dad were Christians growing up. Obviously, I left the faith. Come down to the part with Kalam, a lot of people will call us the Kemetics and all that stuff. Even like with the Kemetic stuff, even now, I would say that I'm kind of not similar, but different from Kalam with that. I think there was a point in time where I did delve into a lot of that information, but then I came to a point where it's like that information can only go so far because there's limited information, and that's just factual. There's limited information that's out there for the masses to actually learn on a mass scale. So, like the brother Kalam mentioned, you have the stories of Asar, Aset, Heru, who else you got? Ra, the Ogdoad, all of them stories. But it's like those stories I feel like that's the only thing that's accessible to the masses.
Right.
Yeah. And it only takes, and there's only a few people that actually have learned and took the time out to delve into that. And then even then, them getting into that, you're not even going to get the full truth because so much text have been missing.
Yeah.
There's not a plethora of information out there to explain that. So for you to now then take that and then try and push that to the masses, I feel like it's kind of like an injustice. Whereas like the Hebrew faith, there's a plethora of information.
Right.
There's a lot of history and stuff that you can gain because it's accessible. You can look up stuff. Whereas with Egypt, most people still don't even know about the name Kemet. They don't even know what that means. And you want to get into all those ancient rituals and this system and the book of the coming forth by day, and no one ain't got time. You're not in the right time, that spectrum to delve into that. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, I found what he was saying very interesting because, right at first hearing, right, he sounds very objective, reasonable. But what I felt like what he was doing was he was front loading an escape hatch for his conversation with vocab. What do I mean? So, he's saying, well, there's not a lot of data. There's only but so much we know about Kemet. So basically what he's saying is you can't really pin anything on me. in this conversation because I've already said, hey, we don't know everything, so I can't really be wrong in this conversation. Whereas vocab, right, he's asking the questions to vocab. So vocab now, he could be wrong. But anytime he refuted or pushed back on anything that he said, he would revert back to this point that he made in the beginning. Well, there's only but so much data we have. I don't really, I find that really interesting. Did you see that as well, vocab? Did you feel that way?
Yes, and I think that's a good observation. But here's what I just want to draw out for everybody to kind of recognize. Even what he just said, I almost wish we could listen to it again. Think about the sheer irony. Now, that's sort of minimally stating it, but really I believe it's God's providence. And here's what I mean by that. Here he is telling the audience, and he's supposed to be some form of a practitioner of this faith, that one of the greatest, most powerful, wealthy, intellectually advanced empires, right, that the world has ever seen, that we still marvel at to this day, the sources of their religion are scant, few far between. Very few people understand them. We don't have a lot to go on, as compared to the Hebrew religion, as he kind of termed it, who were once subjugated by this self-same empire, who never had really a legitimate empire of their own, I guess, unless you want to count the United Kingdom as brief as it was under David and Solomon and whatnot. And then you look and you say, well, how fascinating is that? The religion of the peasants that you oppressed, that were so filthy you didn't even want them to be around, so you put them in Goshen. This is at the end of the book of Genesis, right? Now that religion has a plethora of sources. And the religion of this great, vast, expansive empire, it's scant. I just want everyone to see and relish in the irony and take that as an object lesson of all man's systems pass away, and yet the word of Amen.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely a great point there. So he starts out the conversation with this opening, escape hatch for anything that's going to go on throughout this conversation. So let's go to the next clip here.
The brother Kalam now about God, about God, and the first thing that came into my mind was Genesis. Now, that whole bit where you was talking about Ra and what Ra is and where did he come from and the waters of noon. And the first thing that kicked in my mind, I just went straight into Genesis 1 when it says, the spirit of the God was hovering over the waters. So my question would be is, what are those waters that the spirit of God was hovering over? And then also it makes mention of the void and the darkness. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mention that the void and the darkness was created. Do you understand what I'm saying? And I think there is an actual concept in Kemetic philosophy or teachings talking about the void and the darkness and the waters, the same waters of Nun that Kalamas make mentions. That's the same kind of waters that we see that the spirit of God was hovering over. And then from that passage, actually, do you have the verse? You got Genesis 1 there?
Yeah.
We can have a read. So let's have a read of what it says. So we got here, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and desolate, emptiness, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. So this is where the question I was going to ask you is, the void and the darkness that was there with the spirit, was that created? Was that always with God? And then what are those waters that he was hovering over?
So we're going to stop there. And you do respond there, but we got your voice now. So how did you respond to that question there?
Well, so it is unfortunate that I couldn't speak as much as I wanted to. I don't mean that. I'm not blaming that on him. I'm saying I had to really conserve when I said something, and so I eventually got around to it, BK. But I wish that more so in the beginning, I asked him specifically, tell me which specific account from the Egyptian sources that you're referring to, because I was sort of almost like trying to be charitable and let him get to where he was talking about exactly.
Right.
But if you noticed, I read our source. He never reads his source. That comes towards the end of the conversation when I say, well, is this what you're talking about? Because my thought was to let him get out what specifically he was talking about. And so we finally get there at the end, and then you see how different it is. And it's interesting, even in the language of what he says, what were those waters?
Right.
It says waters. They were waters. That's what they were. What were those waters? They were waters.
Right.
I'm just saying he's just trying to like add stuff into it.
Yeah. He's trying to infer. Right.
Yeah, and also say that it was never created when, of course, Genesis 1:1 says they were created. He's just looking for the same pattern, but we already have Genesis 1:1 before Genesis 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
But that's some of what I would say. But hindsight's 2020. Nonetheless, I think the overall dialogue was good because we did eventually get to some of that stuff.
Right. So yeah, I mean, even if like we talked about this when Kmetic when he dropped his book about how Heiser believes that there's an independent clause. So technically, when you go into the Genesis account, God is using something that's already pre-made. But even Heiser would tell you that doesn't mean that God didn't make it, even if that's the case. You can't make this leap from, all right, he's starting with stuff, but he didn't make that stuff. Like you just can't do that. And the reason why we can't do that is because, the Bible is replete with the claim that God makes everything. So there's a couple of scriptures here I'd like to share. All right. Right. So Colossians 1:16. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Revelations 4:11. Worthy are you, Lord, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. And there's just two scriptures right there. But throughout both Old and New Testament, it's very clear that Yahweh makes everything, including the stuff that we see in the Genesis account. Now, according to what you were saying earlier, and him trying to infer this direct correlation with the Genesis count with the accounts in Kemet, there's a problem, right? Because you have there's a theomarchy is a term that refers to battles among the gods, particularly in the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish. Creation is accomplished in the aftermath of a battle for control of the pantheon and the cosmos. Then you also have a theogony. A theogony is a cosmological work describing the origin and genealogy of the gods. Well, here's the problem. The Genesis account doesn't have either. It just does not. Okay? So when you look at, and you may mention this too, like the various theologies that existed throughout the centuries in Kemet, you had the Heliopolitan theology, right? It says Heliopolitan theology, Nun, the pre-existent primeval ocean, came into being by himself. So as you see, there's a personification here. In one of the Egyptian cosmological speculations, Atum, who arose out of the pre-existent Nun, threatened that the land will return into Nun, into the floodwaters, as in its first state. Thus, it is to be noted that in Heliopolitan cosmological mythology, the watery chaos or waste was pre-existent and was personified as Nun, the mother of gods, or she who bears Re, the sun god, which you guys talked about, identified with Atum each day. So the waters that he was referring to, and the reason why he's trying to, attach it to Genesis, the water is personified. It itself is a deity that produces gods, right? Like Nun, like Re or Atum. So these gods are actually contingent beings. They come from the waters of Nun. You have the Memphite theology, right? In the rival Memphite theology, it's Ptah. The chief god of Memphis is equated with Nun, and is the creative principle itself out of which Atum and all other gods were created. So Ptah is both Nun, the primeval ocean, and Tat Tenin, the primeval land, which arose out of Nun and is equated with the land of Egypt. So all these things are contingent based on this personified waters known as Nun. You got the Hermopolitan cosmogony, right? In their cosmogony, they existed prior to creation an infinite dark watery chaos, whose characteristics are incorporated into the four pairs of gods of the Ogdoad. As the water begins to stir, the primeval hillock emerges from the deep, bringing up the cosmic egg, out of which Re, the sun god, will appear to proceed with the creation of all other things. The new creative events occur in cyclical fashion with the daily rebirth of the sun and the annual receding of the Nile. But in Genesis 1, right, Tehom, the sea, is clearly inanimate. It's a part of the cosmos, not a foe of God, but simply one section of the created world. It does not offer any resistance to God's creative activity. It is therefore unsustainable to speak of a demythologizing of a Babylonian mythical concept or the use of a mythical name in Genesis 1 to suggest there is, in Genesis 1 verse 2, the remnant of a latent conflict between the chaos monster and the creator God is read into from mythology. To the contrary, the author of the Hebrew creation account uses the term Tehum in a depersonalized and non-mythical sense. Tehum is nothing else but a passive, powerless, inanimate element in God's creation. This is from the polemic nature of Genesis Cosmology by Gerald A. Hassel. So this is what he was trying to connect. Because he said that the same waters of Nun is in the waters of Genesis. It's the same thing. No, it's not. Because in Kemetic cosmology, it's personified. It's an actual being that creates these other gods. Whereas in Genesis account, Yahweh doesn't have a theogony, right? He doesn't have an origin story. Yahweh has always been, and he didn't have to beat the water to make the universe, right? So it's just, there is no connection there. So, Vocab, your thoughts before we continue.
Well, yeah, lots of good points, and that's exactly right. And just so people know, even though you know the Kemetic spirituality that we run into a lot online or in person,
right,
it has plenty of elements that can get real spooky and woo-woo real fast, like, levitation and teleportation and these types of things that sneak in, and aliens and all this. But this is a discussion or argument that a version of this argument actually does occur within scholarship. Now, generally speaking, it's what we might call hypercritical, or people might just use the term critical scholarship. Those who are doing it would say, no, this is just real scholarship, mainstream scholarship. But often people don't like to recognize their bias in these matters. But when you have these discussions, you do have people, and part of it is based upon an assumption that revelation doesn't happen. So none of this would be seen within the critical scholarship realm as revelation, because that's not what's happening. God talking to humans, I don't know about all of that, but we can have borrowing and stealing and using other concepts and ideas from other peoples. You see what I'm saying? And so, look, the Hebrews must have got it from these guys. That type of thing does happen and occur. Now, he didn't necessarily bring to bear in the discussion anything that would be considered scholastic. It was sort of outlines, and then the audience is almost left to fill in the blanks, as it were.
Right.
But I do want people to understand that, like, if you go to Arizona State University and take an intro to world religions class or something, you may hear this type of thing in a brief discussion of Genesis, for example. So I just want to let people know that. So there's a lot that's been written on this, and all kinds of opinions and views. And the general way that people who don't understand the Bible to be a cohesive whole, a revelatory word, the general way they approach it is, where are the similarities, and they essentially overemphasize those, and a lot of times fill in the gaps by things from other cultures and insert them into the Hebraic narrative. I
Right.
think a more faithful and respectful way to deal with it is to say, what is the author emphasizing that's different? And that's what stands out, because there's a reason for that.
Right.
Because we should not deny that the Hebrews lived in a cultural, sociological neighborhood.
Right.
They're located in a chronological time and place in a geographical region of the world. My point by saying that is they're not aliens who don't have any shared ideas or language or concepts with any of their neighbors as far as the way they might describe things.
Yep.
But the polemical nature is what's important. And I'll end with this little comment with this is you brought it out, BK, circling back around that in the Egyptian myths, you have these things personified. God is creating these things as part of what he controls and is in charge of in Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
naming them, analyzing them, objectively stating this is good. These are products of his creative genius and power. They're not equal. God is not looking at them as other entities in which he's going to have discussions or battles with. These are products of his ingenuity. That's important to understand. The Egyptian context is radically different, and you can see it even with the existence of the beings, not just in the ones that come into being, but the idea of this self-created being. It is a logical contradiction at its core.
Right.
And it shows you that really in the Egyptian system, who's in charge here? Who's in
Right.
charge here? I
Right.
think the people writing the myths are the ones in charge.
I mean, that's a great point, because even in the Hebrew, when God said he creates something, he says, and it was good. And in the Hebrew, it says functional. So Yahweh is providing functionality to these things.
Yeah, and even tells you one, right? The fourth day. The very thing your neighbors like to worship, the sun, it's the greater light to guide you.
Right, right.
He even tells you what it's for, to know the times and seasons. These are tools, in a sense, that serve mankind, not things that mankind serves. And that's the very inversion of what all pagan idolatrous systems do, is they get the pecking order wrong, so to speak. Right. And I think part of that was brought out in the conversation, especially when it got towards the element of talking about idolatry.
Right. Shout out to Orthodox Moore. To your question, overlap in the sense that, like what Vocab said earlier, and actually I'm going to bring out later on too, they were all in the same region, right? So for Yahweh to explain to his people how unique he is, he's using the world that they exist in to explain that. So yeah, I mean, most societies in the ancient Near East believe that the cosmos began and that something made it happen, right? But where we differ is how and who. You know what I mean? So yeah, so there's going to be some similarities, but again, like what Vocab said, it's the differences that's the main point, right? So that being said, let's get back to the video.
Yes, indeed.
Let me share my screen and we'll take it from here.
What God is? Who is God? What is this?
Right.
You know he's the spirit, but further down the line, we like you and brother mentioned, we have all these attributes: God being merciful, God being angry, God being hateful. Like, where did he obtain and learn these things? If you're in the total Zen void darkness, where did you obtain all of this emotions and these human, I would say, like human-like characteristics? Because these are characteristics that we learn as a human being, as a physical entity. And obviously God is not supposedly human. He's a spirit being, but yet he's possessing a lot of these human qualities like hate, jealousy. Why would you be jealous if there's no one there before you? If there's no one there in existence with you, where would the action of jealousy come from? You understand? Where would the whole anger and stuff, if there isn't someone there for you to contest or to engage in battle or have some sort of, what's the word, controversy, where would the whole hate come from? You understand? Which also brings me to the book of Isaiah. You have Isaiah 45:7, where it says, I, the Lord, create good and evil. I create all these things. These things have come from me. So like these are the just little questions and things that in my mind where I took time to think, okay, where are we going with this? And with regards to, sorry, just a last point, and I can go ahead. With regards to what you were saying about what's the connection between that and ancient Kemet, like am I saying are they both the same and stuff? Now, when we're dealing with ancient Kemet, especially with the Bible, from the Bible's narrative, the author of the first 5 books is attributed to Moses. Yeah. And Moses was raised where? In Egypt.
Yeah, no doubt.
/ Kemet. Now, give me the verse. I think it's in the book of Acts. I don't know what verse
Stephen says he learned the wisdom and all the learning of Egypt. Yeah.
Now, going back to what I said earlier, you know, when we was talking about how can the Kemet thing, can it go any further than what it is? And I said no, because the information is very limited. There's only a certain amount of information that we had. So that's why it can't go to a certain level. Now, going into what the scriptures are saying, it says Moses was learned in all the wisdoms and the knowledge of the ancient Egyptians. Now, you can say today, we only have, I think we have probably a smidget of the information that the ancient Egyptians were talking about. We still don't even know how they built the pyramids. Yeah, we don't know how they was able to make all these carvings, carry 10 ton, 15 ton stones from Aswan all the way up to Cairo. Now, if you're saying that Moses was learned in all the knowledge and all the wisdoms of the ancient Egyptians, that means he would have been well versed in all them ancient stories, all the mathematicians, all the ways that things was created. Do you understand? All the sciences. And even to this day, you know, Egypt is still a place where it's vast with knowledge and people can't comprehend how these people was able to get to the point where they make shows about saying extraterrestrials came and gave them the information. Do you know what I mean? So if Moses was raised with all of that information and all that knowledge, we wouldn't be surprised now where we see little bit of information where it talks about the waters and the spirit of God hovering over the darkness and the void and the nun. We shouldn't be surprised if we see any parallels in information, because he's now an author, and anybody knows if you're an author and you need inspiration, of course, if you're learned and educated in a system or in a country where they're heavily in information, they already had their books and their traditions and their sciences and their medicines and all that. We shouldn't be surprised if someone who is now going to be an author, who's learned and all that, and they said he was mighty in words and in deeds, we shouldn't be surprised if he's now going to take some of that information. We wouldn't say copy, but of course you can borrow some of that information, because that's going to make your story what it is.
Yeah, so quite a bit here that he says. So how did you respond to those multitude of questions?
Yeah, it was tough because if my voice was more robust, the first little section, I probably would have said, hey, well, let me answer that before you go to the next thing, because it ended up being all this stuff, and we can only get to a little bit of it.
Right.
And right there, you see a number of assumptions. You know, he's assuming the Egyptian count is solid and stable, and it's the one that the Hebrews are borrowing from there to give their myth more weight. You see kind of these assumptions built in there, and that Moses being learned in the ways of the Egyptians meant that he borrowed or copied the ways of the Egyptians. You know, he's employing there, in case the audience was trying to draw the connections, the speech that Stephen gave in Acts chapter 7, where as he relays the history of Israel and frequent rejection of God's messengers to the covenant people, in that context, he speaks about Moses, and that's where he got that element from, that sort of specific verbiage to the audience, because I don't know if I heard that part. So you have all that going on, but you know, he's completely unaware, it seems, of the polemical nature of Genesis and how this is really a conflict or battle of ideas, and you see it more implicit in the early chapters of Genesis. But if we take it all together, because remember, he's assuming now Moses, he's using this for his argument, is the author of the first 5 books. Well, then that means Exodus. And Exodus is clearly a battle of the one
Right.
true God Yahweh,
Right.
versus these Egyptian deities. For
Right.
example, you have this situation where nightly there's a battle for the sun to come up again. God is saying the sun will come up because I've given it to you. It's based upon his ordered work.
Right.
There's no question. The chaos is not going to win because God is in charge of what's happening in
Right.
his divinely ordered universe. And
Right.
this is what you see. Exceptions to that are miracles, such as the day the sun stood still. I'm using the colloquial
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
verbiage there. But you see, okay, so who's in charge of this thing that he did? Well, you see this in the plagues, and it's explicit when it goes dark. First of all, it'd be pretty wild to have a pitch black day.
Right.
There's an unsettling feeling about just an eclipse for a little bit.
Yep.
But this is something that tells the Egyptians, Ra didn't make it this time. you know, and but the thing is, they knew the source of the trouble because Moses says this is what Yahweh's going to do. And let me just show one thing, and then I'll stop, paying it back to the
Sure.
host. A book, I don't agree with every little thing in there, but Ancient Myths and Biblical Faith on Fortress Press, Scriptural Transformations by Foster R. McCurley. And look what he says on page 57 under the Yahweh Warrior and King section. And this has to do with tying different things in here, including passages from Isaiah, but I like this summary statement. Finally, the study of the term rebuke demonstrated that Yahweh alone had the authority to calm and put in place the forces which would threaten his purposes and his reign. Only Yahweh had the authority to rebuke, and he exercised that authority over the forces who opposed his reign and threatened his peace and his purposes. Thus, the objects of his rebuke include the primordial waters deep in sea, the enemies who attack Jerusalem, or the king and Satan. On the day of the Lord, when all such opposing chaotic forces shall be vanquished, Yahweh's reign of order will be established universally for all, such as the hope of the oppressed when chaos seems to prevail in history, and this hope, God's history, would reach its ultimate goal. I thought that was a good way to tie it all in
Mm.
there.
That's good. That's good. One thing that he does in the beginning of that clip, he does a lot of question begging, right? He says stuff like, "Well, how did God obtain all these emotions?" Wait a minute, who said that
Obtain,
God obtained anything?
right,
You're assuming that, right? That's part of that's none of us has agreed to that premise that he's
right.
obtaining anything, right? And we know that Yahweh doesn't have to obtain anything. He's the complete package, and always was and always will be, right? So I found that interesting, and that how
I
he
didn't
has
mention
these.
that
Yeah, yeah,
too.
yeah.
I wish you would pay attention because earlier in the conversation with Kalam, I mentioned specifically the characteristic of immutability necessary for a being on which reality is based upon.
Mm,
And I specifically criticized the Egyptian narratives for not having beings at the fount who are immutable. Indeed, they're mutable, meaning they're changing and
right,
undergoing processes that
right,
actually affect them. They're
right,
they're they're not stable. But with God, he's immutable. So that's specific. So he's later on telling us how did God learn this stuff and
right,
obtain this?
right,
How was he taught it? I think he even said once.
right, right. And okay, you messed up my thing now. I was
I'm
saying
so
something else.
sorry. You were saying how he is asking how God learned this, but you just were
Right,
saying how it's
right,
part
and
of his nature.
right. So, and that God has these human emotions.
Right, right.
I'm like, God came first. Well, he was here first, buddy. He made
Yeah,
the humans. So it's not he doesn't have what they have. We have what he's
right.
given us.
Yes.
So again, a lot of question begging here. And then he goes into something that we see a lot in the Kemetic community, the whole God created evil, right? We see that a lot. So with that being said, let me
And the last thing you said ties into the other part of the beginning of the conversation with Kalam, where I mentioned how it's clear in Scripture Adam and all his descendants bear the imago Dei, or made in the image of God. And Kalam tried to say, "Oh, we have that in Kemet too." And then when I pressed him, he said, "Well, that was changed at some points to meaning only the royalty or the kings were made in the image of God." So it's an
right,
inconsistent message
right,
there. And that was important too, because that shows we have a cause within our own sources to say we are bearing the marks of God, albeit under sin, versus him bearing our marks,
right,
meaning we're made in his image. So he has a perfect form of whatever emotion you would state if we were going to use the term emotion. And we have often a sin marred version of it, but we're the ones who are bearing his image, not
Right.
vice versa.
And actually, the creation of humans was actually kind of inconsequential in one of the. I always forget if it's the Memphite or the Hemopolitan theology that the God lost his daughters and son, and he sent his eye to go look for them, and then when he finally found them, he had cried tears of joy, and it's those tears that begat humanity. So it wasn't like he was trying to make humans. It was just, oh, look at this, humans, you know. And then in other creation stories in the ancient Near East, we know that humans were just created just to serve and feed the gods, and that was it. And that's not what we see again in Genesis as well. But anyway, so the whole evil thing, right? So this is from a topical lexicon, defining the range and meaning. The Hebrew noun and adjective ra embraces moral evil, wicked conduct, hurtful speech, harmful intent, malignant character, and the concrete outworking of such evil in disaster, calamity, or misery. Whether describing an inner disposition, an outward act, or the painful consequences of sin, the term consistently stands in antithesis to good, right? So it's explaining how the range this one word has, right? And then part of the range is evil as calamity or disaster. Ra can denote the painful consequences God sovereignly brings to chasten or judge. Does disaster come to a city unless the Lord has done it? Amos 3:16. The same semantic field appears in Isaiah 45, verse 7, where God creates calamity. Exodus 32:14 recounts that the Lord relented from the disaster Ra he had planned, showing both his justice and mercy. That's what God means when he says, I created, evil. It's not that it's calamity, because he's chastising, he's punishing people, and people love to use the King James version of Isaiah 45:7 because they smuggle in their modern day understanding of that term in that passage. But if you was from there, the King James English, the people of the 16th and 17th century, they understood what he meant in that passage. We don't anymore because it's anachronistic to us, right? So that's why we know that it means disaster, calamity, right? So this thing about Moses, right? He connects Moses. So basically, I don't have the data to make the connection, but Moses does, right? That's kind of his argument. So this is from the Lost World of Genesis by John Walton. He says, as a result, we're not looking at ancient literature to try to decide whether Israel borrowed from some of the literature that was known to them. It is to be expected that the Israelites held many concepts and perspectives in common with the rest of the ancient world. This is far different from suggesting literature was borrowed or copied. This is not even a case of Israel being influenced by the peoples around them. Rather, we simply recognize the common conceptual worldview that existed in ancient times. We should therefore not speak of Israel being influenced by that world. They were part of that world, right? And this is something that you said earlier, like they lived in this region. So yeah, they're going to have some understanding of the various cultures around them. Israel did not exist in a vacuum. It says here, also, the texts serve as sources of information for us to formulate the shape of each culture's ways of thinking. In most areas, there's more similarity between Israel and its neighbors than there is between Israel and our 21st century Western world. As another example, even though today we believe in one God, the God of Israel, and therefore share with them this basic element of faith, the views of deity in the ancient world served as the context for Israel's understanding of deity. It is true that the God of the Bible is far different from the gods of the ancient cultures, but Israel understood its God in reference to what others around them believed. So him bringing up Moses really undercuts his argument, right? Because yes, was Moses trained in the ways in literature of ancient Kemet? Absolutely, which makes him qualified to write such a polemical creation account. Because you can't go against something if you don't know what that thing is.
Mm-hmm.
Moses knows very well. He grew up, you know, even though he grew up in Pharaoh's household, he always was proud of being a Hebrew. How do we know? Well, when an Egyptian was oppressing one of his brothers, what did he do? He killed him. He killed an Egyptian. Then he had a bounce because he got found out. So it's not like we know where Moses' loyalties lay. You know what I mean? We're not. There's no doubt. You know. So, but because of him understanding, it's kind of like in a rap battle, right? The rap battles that we love are the ones where the opponent knows the other guy so well and
Yeah.
uses things to attack him. Right? That those are the ones we like. Like, oh, he knew about this and he knew about that. Right? That makes the punchlines that much more spicy. Right? So Moses writes one of the most seething and scathing diss tracks in his creation accounts. Right? So
Let me show people this little poem here, little hymn. I know you're about to bring something on the screen. You can do it while I'm doing this if you're
no,
okay.
we good. Yeah.
This is a hymn to the sun god at the point where now he had been merged with the god Ammon, and this shows also how these deities. It's like their origin stories depending on the continuity. Meaning, like if you look at Marvel Comics, every iteration of Wolverine's not the same. There's different backstories
Right.
and
Right.
different versions. Weapon X, this, that, boom, this, and it's similar with these fictional Egyptian gods. So now you have Ammon Re. This is from the 14th century BC. Listen to what it says. You can find this in the ANET, page 367. Here's what it says: the Soul King, like the fluid of the gods, with many names, unknown in number, rising in the eastern horizon and going to rest in the western horizon, who overthrows his enemies, reborn early every day. Thy crew is in joy when they see the overthrow of the rebel, his body licked up by the knife. So here you have Amun Re, sun god, who's reborn every day. Has to beat up his enemies every day. He rises in the east and it goes. It's clearly just deifying the sun is all it is. And you have this rebirth of the sun god Re after his nocturnal journey, but it's not automatic. Each night in the darkness, Re encounters a serpent, Apophis, and he attempts to swallow him. So Re, who's supposed to be the life-giving one, has to battle this force of chaotic darkness and serpentine form. And yet you look at scripture, the sun's created, serpents are created. Name something that's not created. Oh, just God. He's the only uncreated one.
Right.
And so it's like, come on, man. Come on, man. This
Right.
is
So
not the same
not
thing.
only do they have a theogony, it's a daily theogony. Every day he's born. Every day.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that song Everyday Struggle, Biggie? Ray.
that was derived from Ancient Kemet.
Except it's every night struggle.
Every night struggle.
Yeah, we got to make a remix. Every night struggle about him battling the serpent god and barely making it through.
Right. So again, right, I just found it interesting, and I guess he wasn't aware that you knew as much as you did about Ancient Kemet, but I think just in case that's why he made the escape route, just in case he couldn't get you on anything, and that you can, reverse Uno card him. He could be like, well, there's not a lot of data, it's only what little we know. But then he'll turn around and then be like, but Moses knew.
Yeah.
So, aha. I was like, no, that doesn't work, bro. That actually works against you. So, but so at the end, like, what's your thoughts after the discussion with him?
Well, the Kmetic community, disparate and scattered as it is in the UK, a little more sane than the Kmetic community in the US.
Right.
They first of all know how to have decent discussions and dialogues without, bursting a blood vessel, and that's nice.
Right.
And they know how to talk about stuff without all these like cheap shots at the Christian faith. I'm not saying they won't do it or nothing like that, but I found it overall refreshing.
Mm.
If somebody watches it and says, "Wow, vocab, you should have did this and should have done that," you're probably right. I probably should have a few things, not excuses, but it was at the end of the trip. It was at the end of the day. But I just wanted to make sure we got it in, and I knew I didn't have much of a voice left, so I had to do a lot more listening than talking, and maybe that works out for the best because I do believe we have a good situation for future conversations.
Yeah.
Because a number of the guys said, "Hey, next time, let's do this. We got this idea," so we have, by God's grace, an ongoing relationship. And I think that's important too. It's not just about a one off video and can hopefully continue to build. So I don't have, we're doing a review, but we're trying to make it fair and, and
Mm-hmm.
um, I hope and respectful. We might make fun of the Egyptian gods a little bit, but, he was a real chill guy behind the scenes and on
Mm.
camera. I don't have any kind of negative thing. I'm blessed to know these guys. And I thought it was interesting when he says, "Of course, I was raised Christian." I thought that was interesting, and it just made me think. What has he heard? What has he seen? What does he
Mm.
know? What was his experience, if any, with the Lord and His Word? It was an interesting way he even put it. Of course, I was raised Christian,
Right.
and now he's in obviously a very different place. But I would I would commend him to continue doing Bible study and maybe kind of let it stand on its own 2 feet, not just through the eyes of Kemet. Take off those Kemetic glasses and say, what is this really saying? And just entertain the idea that the actual one true God could be speaking to you through His Word, because
Right.
many people, including native Egyptians, have found that indeed the Creator of the universe is speaking through His Word, starting in Genesis.
Yeah. And we're hoping that maybe this discussion you had with him could be that at least a pebble in his shoe, as Greg Koku would say, right? And this could be the beginning for him, because we do what we
Could be the
do.
Genesis.
Wah, wah. You see, he's
Uh,
doing so good until he did that. Uh, but we really hope that these conversations, these debates, these videos will cause people to think about where they're at, and hopefully it would be the beginning of a journey back to God, or the first time ever with the gospel. So, because that's the intent. That's always the end game. With all these things that we do, the end game is we just want to see people come to Christ and be our brothers and sisters, right? So,
Amen. 100%. Just like our brother in St. Louis, who that happened with.
yeah,
Was
DMG, big up
for sure.
DMG,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Shout out.
absolutely.
Now, let me know if you want me to come on next time and talk about who else I talked to in London.
Oh yeah, we gotta do that. Yeah. I've done a video on these guys before. So,
Oh, really?
oh yeah,
That's
yeah.
the London branch of the Nuwabians, but they call themselves Wu Sabat. But they've got a
Right.
store there and everything. OSM Vision is a pretty big channel, so
Yeah, very big channel.
I
Absolutely. Yeah,
picked I picked up their book.
we might have to do that. We might have to do that. So, all right,
Yeah.
cool. So, with that being said, man, Vocab, thank you for your time. I know you're running around here, so I always appreciate when you come through. And with that, we are out. Peace.